Chris Hedges, he'd be my pick for Secretary of State rather than little Marco Rubio. Apart from anything else, he certainly wouldn't be owned by Miriam Adelson, but he has many more attributes than that. Pulitzer Prize winner, former head of the New York Times Middle East Bureau, a man used to the kind of things that we've seen over the last couple of days, and I'm keen, as I know you will be, to get his take. Well, as I asked Professor Morandi, Chris, what just happened there?
Well, the same thing that happened in Gaza, which is a complete disregard for international law. The seizing of Maduro and his wife on the pretense of drug trafficking, and there's no evidence, by the way, Maduro is actually not suspected of being involved in the narcotics trade at all. It makes as much sense as perpetuating a genocide in the name of Israel's right to defend itself. We know what this is about, the same thing that the invasion of Iraq was about. It is about the seizure of vast oil reserves. It is about breaking the back of any government or regime that defies the United States. We saw that again in the Middle East with the attacks against Hezbollah on the part of Israel, the bombings in Iran, both by Israel and the United States, and Israel's decimation of the military infrastructure in Syria following the overthrow of Assad. So it's about a world without law, a world without rules, where the strong prey on the weak, and that is, and what's frightening, of course, at the very moment that they're carrying out this incredible, egregious violation of his Venezuelan sovereignty, they're already talking about Cuba and Iran.
Well, we'll come to some of those points later, but this law of the jungle, and it was, I think, perfectly personified by Donald Trump in his train crash interview. I don't know if his officials are unable to persuade him when to shut up, but the more he went on, the more damning were the things that he was saying. But this might catch on, Chris. I mean, on the basis of what Trump did and said about what he did, Moscow could land troops in Kiev right now and seize Zelensky and take him for trial. The Chinese could do the same in Taiwan. Turkey could do the same in Cyprus. I mean, this law of the jungle can cut two ways, can't it?
Of course. Well, it essentially, and I would go back to the UN ratification, Security Council's ratification with Chinese and Russia abstentions, endorsing this ridiculous, you can't call it a peace plan, it's a sham of a peace plan. And that's where the UN Security Council went to die, in essence. And we were watching a disintegration of the rules-based order, which was often violated by imperial powers like the United States, of course. But there's no pretense anymore. And that's precisely what led to the catastrophic global wars in World War I or World War II. There was no mechanism to thwart the predatory nature of stronger states upon weaker states. And that's essentially the role the United States is playing at this point. It's very frightening and very ominous.
Are the United States strong enough to carry this on? I mean, they're openly threatening Denmark. They're openly threatening Iran. They're in war by other means against China. They were involved, many people believe, in the attack on President Putin's residence in Sochi, in Valdai. They are basically at war on multiple fronts. Are they strong enough for that?
Well, that's a very good question. I think you have to look at the United States empire as a wounded animal that's lashing out ultimately futilely to regain a lost hegemony. And that's what late empires do. And they engage in military adventurism, which only accelerates the decline. They have the military force to initially succeed. in the same way that Israel is initially succeeding in the Middle East. But the long-term consequences, as we saw with the 20 years of debacles in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria, they can't deal with. They create Frankensteinian monsters of their own creation that slay them ultimately. But the preponderance of military force that they have, Israel has it, the United States has it, allows them to carry out what's classically termed as overreach. And then they essentially light these conflagrations that they can't put out and that grow and that further their own demise. So initially, yes. Ultimately, in the long term, it's self-destructive.
Now, it's clear that Washington has accepted that the acting president, Rodriguez, in Caracas, is in charge of the country. I've seen, as you will have, massive mobilizations of the Chavista forces in Venezuela all day today. The American networks were having to show footage from Miami and pretend it was from Venezuela, welcoming the kidnapping of the president, because the actual footage in Venezuela was of crowds of millions of people in support of the revolution. The Chavista movement is in power in Caracas still. So what have we got here? This conundrum that exists, where the prince over the water is awaiting his day in court, whilst the movement that he led is still in power in the streets in Caracas. How is that a win for the United States?
It's not. It's a kind of Pyrrhic victory, of course. They get Maduro. But they haven't in any way affected the structure. I mean, you saw with the invasion of Iraq, they, of course, immediately and foolishly dismissed all Ba'ath Party members who had worked for Saddam Hussein and disbanded the armed forces and the security forces. And what did they get? They got a virulent insurgency that eventually threw the United States out of Iraq. And the United States companies did not finally, ultimately get the oil fields, which is what they went into Iraq to seize, in the same way that they're attempting to seize the oil fields in Venezuela. So, by taking out a figure like Saddam Hussein or taking out a figure like Maduro, but essentially not being able to mollify or subdue the security and military forces, not to mention the popular rage at being occupied. Nobody wants to be occupied, Iraqis any more than Venezuelans. That's the whole point. That's my point of creating these Frankensteinian monsters of your own creation. So there's tremendous blowback that, as we saw in the Middle East, is self-defeating. And unfortunately, that's a lesson that the United States empire has not learned. And it's not learned because all of the people who have orchestrated those catastrophes have never been held to account. In fact, they still remain in power.
Was there a traitor in the camp? It's very hard to believe that the United States was able to fly slow-moving helicopters across the skyline in Caracas. We all saw it. If there had been any concerted effort to bring them down, then several of them would have been. It's impossible for me to believe that the president doesn't have sufficient force around him to prevent him and his wife being kidnapped and taken in chains. I mean, you're a man who's acutely conscientized about the origins of your country and the great influx of slaves. It seems to me the Americans love to see people in chains, and that's what we saw Nicolas Maduro in today. But somehow, even in chains, he looked twice the man of the men that had chained him.
In terms of someone on the inner circle, well, I'm almost certain. I mean, the CIA has deep pockets. They have many mechanisms by which they can turn people to essentially act as informants or work on their behalf. I mean, I was overseas, as you know, for 20 years. That was very common. And I agree with you that I think it would have been extremely difficult unless there were moles around Maduro that were assisting the CIA-backed, Delta Force-backed effort. Uh, yeah, I mean, look, this isn't a new story for Latin America. I spent 6 years in Latin America, covered the wars in El Salvador, Guatemala, and Nicaragua. It's not a new story at all. But in fact, Latin Americans are far more conscious of their history and the role of Yankee imperialism in their historical experience than Americans are. And they connect the dots. The Marines landed in Nicaragua to hunt down Augusto Sandino and install Somoza, the dictator of Nicaragua. They landed in the Dominican Republic in 1965 to overthrow a leftist government. They overthrew Arbenz in Guatemala in 1954. They overthrow and facilitated the rise of the dictator Pinochet in 1973 in Chile. I mean, it's on and on and on. And this is just part of that long history of egregious violation and control done by the American imperial power on the behalf of economic interests, whether that was United Fruit in Guatemala or Anaconda Copper in Chile.
I think that Maduro, who's quite a figure, as you know, will dominate the Southern District of New York courtroom, presumably televised live to the world, in a way that may make the US rue the day that they embarked on this. Why didn't they just kill him?
Well, that's what they did with Osama bin Laden, who was probably sold out by the Pakistani ISI. I mean, that's a good question. I mean, the reason they didn't want to bring Osama bin Laden to trial is they didn't have much on him. Al Qaeda may have been behind 9/11; it probably was, but they didn't have much to lynch him on, and they have nothing to lynch Maduro on. It's anecdotal, but Scheinbaum in Mexico and Maduro were considered the two Latin American leaders that had kept their distance from the drug trade, from the narcotraficantes, they've been hitting those boats repeatedly, and with no evidence that they were smuggling drugs at all. So again, it's a fiction. Again, fentanyl, of course, is the killer in the United States. There's no evidence that I know of that Colombia is a source of fentanyl. So, yeah, I think you're right. I don't think they have a case against him, and if he's allowed a free trial. But that's a big if. I mean, there are courtrooms in the United States, like the Eastern District Court of Virginia, where it's one step away from the Lubyanka.
Yeah. Now, I know that you are a man who supports gun control quite religiously. But what do you make of a charge against the president of Venezuela that he was in possession of machine guns?
Well, but because that's the paucity of the case. So he was involved in drugs, and of course he had machine guns. Well, I can guarantee you there's plenty of lethal weaponry surrounding any head of state, including, of course, Trump. So it shows the absolute absurdity of the indictment that was written up against him. In the indictment, by the way, they call him the de facto and former president, if I have that right, so it was obviously written up some time ago. It wasn't written up while he was being transported to Brooklyn.
Wow. Now, the heads of the crime families were in conclave in Miami, in Florida, in Mar-a-Lago, I should say, over New Year. I must say there's an unusually close relationship between Donald Trump and Netanyahu. If I were Melania, I'd be getting a bit concerned about it. He's always around. He's even there for the holidays. He's boarding and lodging in their house. What could they possibly have been discussing in this latest conclave?
I think Iran. I think it's all Israel's made it clear they want more strikes. They want the U.S. to join them, and Trump has seen willing to sign on for that project. I think it's Iran. I think the Israelis are intent upon. I mean, they have this fantasy in Israel about regime change, that they can bomb Iran into regime change. It's kind of the fantasy, I suppose, that was used to perpetuate what's happened in Venezuela. But I think Iran, I'm guessing, but I think Iran was probably number one.
Well, Channel 13 in Israel this evening, which is not always right, but often is, they've said that Israel is sufficiently emboldened by the brilliance of Donald Trump's operation in Caracas to try the same kind of thing in downtown Tehran. What do you think the end result of that would be?
I mean, those things can get very, very messy very quickly. The United States operation was, from the perspective of the United States, quite successful. The decapitation of Hezbollah with the explosive pagers was quite successful. But when they go wrong, they go terribly, terribly wrong. So it's a big gamble. I think that if the Israelis attempt a similar kind of snatch of the Iranian leadership, Iran is not Venezuela, and Iran is not Lebanon, and Iran is not Syria, and Iran is not Hezbollah. Iran was able to inflict some pretty serious damage on Israel. Much of it was hidden, by the way. They hit sites, and Israel blocked, I know from friends in the press, they blocked reporting about those security sites and intelligence sites that Iran did hit. But Israel's not built to sustain a war of attrition. I mean, I aside from the fact that it is patently, a violation of international law and international sovereignty and the UN Charter and everything else, these kinds of activities, which the Trump administration has already expressed their desire to expand, eventually blow up in your face. And that's a lesson we should have learned. The United States should have learned in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Libya, in Syria, in Afghanistan, both times in Afghanistan when they empowered the Mujahideen to go after the Soviets, and then when they tried to occupy and control Afghanistan for 2 decades. So this is headed down a very, very frightening path. And the success of the operation in Venezuela may, in fact, accelerate the collapse of the U.S. empire, because it will begin to carry out all sorts of other activities that not only won't go well, but will backfire on them in horrific ways, in the way that the 20 years of debacles in the Middle East backfired on the United States.
Finally, Chris, and I'm grateful for your time, what does this mean for the other players in the region? Rubio singled out Cuba today, said the Cuban government was now in serious trouble. What does it mean for China, that was left, to borrow a metaphor from Al Pacino in The Godfather, left with its dick in its hand in Caracas, meeting Maduro just hours before he's then kidnapped, and China not able really to do anything other than condemn it? What does it mean for Russia, which was and is very closely associated with Venezuela? What does it mean for the other players?
Well, it creates more antagonisms. Remember, China and Russia also have alliances with Iran. And as the United States goes completely rogue, we can start with the genocide, but not only the genocide, as I mentioned, the bombings in Yemen, the bombings in Iran, the invasion, let's call it what it is, in Venezuela. As these things expand, other powers, major powers like Russia and China, will have to become more aggressive, in a sense, to counter the aggressivity of the United States. I think that's what it means. And further alienation with major nuclear powers. Believe me, these people like Rubio and Miller and Vance and Trump, you do not want these people controlling a nuclear arsenal with no oversight at all. Congress is just a specter, a ghost. It's an useless appendage. It doesn't even pass legislation. I think they passed 38 bills last year, which is virtually zero. Trump rules by executive decree. He didn't even inform Congress of what he was doing in Venezuela. So as the United States goes rogue, it forces other major powers to react.
Goes
and that's
rogue,
what you'll
it
see.
really goes rogue. Give us a taste, if you will, Chris. And this time I promise you, finally. Give us a taste of how this is playing in Peoria. How is it playing in the liberal printing publishing houses? How is it playing on MSNBC?
It's being condemned on the one hand. On the other hand, everything that's being condemned by the Democratic Party and the liberal establishment is meaningless because they won't take any active measures to thwart Trump. What are those measures? That's mass mobilization, strikes. At this point, the only ability to curb the rising authoritarianism and the evisceration of the rule of law. But they won't call for that because the Democratic Party leadership is despised and hated and is as beholden to corporate and oligarchic power as Trump is. And they know that if they were actually to build those kind of mass movements, it's why the Democratic Party establishment has been so hostile to the new mayor of New York, Mamdani. I mean, they treat him as if he has leprosy. Why? Because those movements would sweep them aside. And they've decided they would rather stay in power as the ship sinks than give up power, and the ship is sinking.